Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 7 February 2025. At 3:45 p.m. on Friday, 7 February 1845, 180 years ago today, the Portland Vase was destroyed in an act of vandalism. The Portland Vase is one of the greatest works of cameo glass to survive from antiquity. Cameo glass is a difficult technique to master, and it hasn't been a common medium for artistic expression. Only a handful of cameo glass masterpieces have survived from the ancient world, and many of them are reassembled from fragments. Artists of the Middle Ages recognized the rarity and value of cameos and sometimes incorporated surviving cameos into their own art. The cross of Lothair, believed to have been made around AD 1000, incorporates a cameo of Augustus, which is supremely ironic, you could say, to have a Roman imperial symbol smack dab in the center of a Christian symbol, taking pride of place, as it were. And the crown of Sancho IV incorporates two Roman cameos, one of Drusus the Younger and one of the legendary Queen Omphale of Lydia. Here, the symbolism seems more consistent as medieval monarchs wished to be identified with ancient royalty as the legitimate heirs to that historically sanctioned authority. The Portland vase was discovered about 1600, one story being that it was found in the sarcophagus of the Roman Emperor Alexander Severus, who was the successor of the disastrous Elagabalus. It passed through several hands, being known for a time as the Barberini vase because it was in the collection of Pope Urban VIII, who was from the Barberini family. And then it passed through more hands and eventually came into the possession of William Cavendish Bentinck, third Duke of Portland, and since then it's been known as the Portland vase. The Duke lent the vase to the British Museum, supposedly for safekeeping, and has been on display in the British Museum starting in 1810. At least one person has argued that it is of modern manufacture, but most historians recognize it as a work of ancient manufacture. It was while it was on display at the British Museum that a visitor to the gallery threw a statue onto the glass holding the Portland vase, shattering both the glass case and the vase. The fragments of the shattered vase were retained at that time. There's a watercolor by Thomas H. Shepard of the Portland vase fragments from later the same year that it was shattered, presumably painted as part of the process of the first reassembly of the fragments in 1845. A century later, in 1948, the vase was taken apart again and reassembled using several fragments that had not been incorporated into the earlier reconstruction. In 1988 and 1989, it was again restored, with this restoration predicted to be good for about another century. So perhaps it will be restored again near the end of the present century. There's something deeply disturbing about a delicate artifact having survived for almost 2,000 years being casually destroyed by an act of mindless vandalism. But this happens with some frequency. No sooner are artifacts dug up than many of them are promptly destroyed. Archaeologists themselves emphasize that the excavation of a site is also the destruction of that site, meaning you can't dig that site again. At least you can't dig it in the same way as you dug it before. After Heinrich Schliemann excavated Troy, other archaeologists have gone to the site not only to excavate remaining pristine parts of the site, but also to dig through the enormous rubbish heaps that Schliemann left. So there is a sense in which a site can be excavated more than once, but of course there's a catastrophic loss of information with each excavation. But it's not only the destruction of the site that's excavated, it's also usually the beginning of the rapid deterioration of any artifacts that are uncovered. Artifacts survive because they happen to have put in a place, or they wound up in a place that was conducive to their preservation. Once taken out of this naturally preserving context, they begin to degrade. In many cases, it would have been better for the artifacts themselves if they had remained buried, as to be discovered is to be at a greater risk of destruction than to remain hidden. Glass is among the most fragile and beautiful of ancient artifacts to infrequently survive the tumult of history. If a piece of glassware survives buried in the ground, it could remain there in principle until that piece of the Earth's crust is pushed back down into the mantle, in fact, if it's not in fact located at a craton. If the glassware is excavated, it is obviously immediately vulnerable. There was a display case of 74 ancient glass vessels at the Archaeological Museum at the American University of Beirut in Beirut, Lebanon, that was destroyed by an explosion on 4 August 2020, so less than 5 years ago. While the definitive cause of the explosion isn't yet clear, this is not a casual act of vandalism like the destruction of the Portland Vase, but the apparent protection of the museum, as in the case with the Portland Vase and the British Museum, was again little protection for these fragile artifacts. It doesn't really matter in the end whether the damage is intentional or unintentional, whether it's random violence by a deranged individual or planned destruction carried out in a very rational way. The result is the same. And again, destruction is followed by attempted restoration as specialists sort through the glass fragments and reassemble them. When the Portland vase was destroyed, the curators of the museum had to sort through the glass, both of the broken Portland vase and the display case it was in. And once again, just recently with the Beirut explosion, the curators of the museum, with help that came from other museums around the world, had to sort through all the glass of the cases that they were being displayed in and pick out the fragments of the Roman glass that had been displayed in them. The Portland vase has been reassembled and taken apart and reassembled many times. Each time, the restorers have been able to reintegrate more of the fragments which were saved after the original act of vandalism. And these reconstructions are themselves an interesting story, and it's a part of a larger story of an attempt to rescue and restore artifacts that have been destroyed and the improving technology for being able to do so. No sooner is an artifact discovered than it's subject to vandalism, and no sooner is an artifact subject to vandalism than an effort is made to restore it. In my episode on Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, I said that very few buildings from classical antiquity have survived intact into the modern world, which is a somewhat similar case. However, buildings are much more robust than cameos or glass, obviously, but buildings are also large, they attract attention, and they become quarries for later construction. So we may well have more intact cameo glass from the ancient world than we have intact ancient buildings, depending on how we define what intact is. The artifacts that have survived buried in the ground or shut into tombs could in some cases have remained there indefinitely in their preserved state. As the technologies and techniques of surveying sites improves, we can learn a lot from ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR, but we're never going to learn as much from this as we learn from a scientific excavation of the site. But the decision of whether or not to excavate a site doesn't occur in a vacuum. Looters will dig up sites that archaeologists haven't excavated, doing far more damage and yielding far less knowledge. The argument could be made that even a poor or quick archaeological excavation is to be preferred to allowing a site to be looted, since we can't or won't bear the cost of guarding archaeological sites. But say we leave all these problems aside, and we suppose that we continue to excavate archaeological sites, deriving as much scientific knowledge as we can from them, while also uncovering presumably more ancient artifacts. What do we do with these artifacts? Well, hopefully we conserve them and display them in museums for the edification of the public. The technologies and techniques of conservation are improving all the time, and contemporary museums can provide an environment for the conservation of artifacts that could, in principle, be extended indefinitely. In this way, the deterioration of excavated artifacts can be limited or arrested as long as we can continue this. But how long can this regime last? What happens to museums when civilizations collapse? When social institutions fail and the electricity goes off, all of the climate-controlled conditions inside museums will end, and at that point, any artifacts would have been better off left where they were in the ground. If we assume that civilization in something like its current form will endure for as long as humanity endures, so that when civilization ends, humanity also ends, and there's then no longer any human reason for our artifacts to be conserved, then that's one way to dispose of the question. But it's at least equally likely that civilization will pass through many cycles of development and collapse during the time that remains for humanity, so that each collapse of a civilizational regime will mean artifacts abandoned in museums, beginning to degrade, being looted, dispersed, and lost for good. There's a scene in the Battlestar Galactica television series, the second one in the present century and not the original one in the previous century, where some of the characters return to an abandoned museum on Caprica with displays still in their glass cases, which is, you could say, the immediate aftermath of the end of a civilization that's been imagined in that episode. The next stage is to imagine the abandoned museum slowly collapsing on the artifacts and burying them again. Just as there's a catastrophic loss of information with each excavation of an archaeological site, there would be a loss of artifacts with each reburying of them, since those artifacts that survived their first burial are in no way guaranteed to be fortunate in their second burial in a collapsing museum. The next stage to imagine is something like in the novel The Mote in God's Eye, where the motes, as they're called in the novel, live on an isolated planet and pass through many cycles of expansion and collapse of their civilization. There are large museums on the planet that are protected by locks that require a given threshold of scientific sophistication to open. Once a recovering society on the Moti planet reaches this level of sophistication, they have access to the museums, and then they learn about the deep past of their planet. We could do something like this on Earth, but we aren't yet at a level of technological development that we could build such a museum that could survive a catastrophe intact and only admit later generations when they reach a given level of sophistication. We can see then that these and similar ideas have been entertained in science fiction, but they won't remain science fiction forever. They are, or they will be, real problems for us someday. We could design museums so that they continue to protect the artifacts they house, even after the staff is gone and the electricity is off. That won't stop looters, but it would tend to the preservation of artifacts not regarded as worth looting. We could exhaustively document artifacts and then inter them in some way that they would be likely preserved over the longue durée. And this is already being done to some extent. For example, the damage to the Lascaux cave caused it to be closed to all visitors quite some time ago, in fact. A reproduction of the Lascaux cave paintings has opened nearby the original cave. It's made for the purpose of serving tourists, but I can say from my own perspective that I wouldn't even bother to visit the reproduction, nor would I be interested in a virtual visit. One of the reasons I visit museums is to see actual artifacts with my own eyes and not to look at a picture in a book. It's not the same, but of course I understand why it's being done. The particular admixture of artifacts from the past that any one of us is able to see in our life is a function of the period of history in which we happen to live. If I had lived between 1940 and 1963, I might have been able to see the Lascaux cave paintings with my own eyes, but at the present, that's not a possibility. There are probably many caves of prehistoric art still undiscovered, still preserved in their pristine state, and some of these may yet to be discovered in the future, long after I'm dead, and some may never be discovered at all. I hope that I live long enough to learn that, to take one example, that the tomb of Nefertiti is discovered. And in this case, I would be happy just to see photographs of the artifacts and paintings it contains, as I probably wouldn't be able to see the tomb itself. But at the present time, viewing the tomb of Nefertiti and its artifacts is not an option. But a couple of times, the accidents of history have worked in my favor. As a child, I saw the King Tut exhibit when it came to Seattle in 1978, which was the first time in my life to see something truly ancient with my own eyes and not merely in a photograph. It did make a deep impression on me, too. And a few years ago, I had the remarkable good fortune to be in a city when the Bactrian Horde was on display. I never imagined that I would lay my own eyes on the Bactrian Horde, but there I was shuffling past the glass cases of gold artifacts with hundreds of other people. And as it turns out, my seeing the Bactrian Horde was even luckier than I realized at the time. The treasure was discovered in 1978 by a Soviet archaeologist, but not long after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, it disappeared. The treasure surfaced again in 2003, but with the Taliban regaining control of Afghanistan, the treasure has disappeared again. So I had an opportunity to see it during the brief window between 2003 and 2021, a window of less than 20 years of opportunity. And we can't know if it will surface again at all. And perhaps it will. Perhaps it'll appear again long after I'm dead. But I'm truly grateful that I got to see this treasure in its brief period of public exhibition. But this was a historical accident, not something planned. But it was a historical accident that has shaped my view of the past. Similarly, the particular admixture of artifacts that others have viewed in the past, or that others will view in the future, shaped or will shape their view of the past, hence their relationship to the past, hence their understanding of their place in history. Museums are intended to give us a comprehensive view of our place in history, but they are as much at the mercy of history as is any individual. They are a record of the past, but also they are a record of the present. That is to say, what the present holds of the past, which is always changing. This may sound like an odd reflection, but there's actually quite a bit more to say about this. It's related to my recent new series of thought experiments in civilization, and I hope to soon release another episode on this. And it's also related to a manuscript I'm working on about the historical vicissitudes of value, our relationship to the past as mediated by value, and especially the fate of value over the longue durée. So here's hoping that I'm able to finish at least some of this work and offer a fuller exposition of the ideas that I've touched on here. So thanks for listening.